Hello, good morning. Hope you all are fine. Welcome to this SANDHAN-AGIC, English Literature and Criticism. Today, we have with us Dr. Santosh Das, who is an Associate Professor from Arts and Commerce College, Savli. Another guest or subject expert today is Dr. Deeptha Achar. She is also an Associate Professor from MS University. Today, we are going to discuss on the rise of the English novel. So, we have the experts from, wonderful experts from Gujarat. So, let's without wasting time, listen to them.
Good morning. And what we are going to do today is to discuss the novel. And I'm sure all of you who study major English and also English as a subsidiary subject will at some point be studying one novel, two, or maybe even more. But in order to think about the novel, we really need to understand what is a novel. Santosh, can you tell us a little bit about what the novel is?
When we are talking about the rise of the novel, the first question that confronts us, is what is a novel? And novel, as we know, those who are doing their major in English, they know that the novel has many definitions.
Please look at the slide.
There is no one definition which will satisfy you entirely, because this is a form which has grown over 300 years, and many literary writers, historians, critics have defined it differently, and there is one definition is differs from another, because the literary historians or literary critics understanding of the history of the form is different. But what we have on the slide are three definitions. The first definition, as you can see on your screen, is it reads
An extended fictional work in prose, usually in the form of a story.
So look at this definition, and you can read that this is the first definition talks about an extended fictional work. That means it's a long fictional, it has to be long, and it has to be in prose, and it usually tells a story. And the second definition, as you see it, it says that the novel is fresh, something new, and something original, and of a kind not seen before. So it is, as you can see, the novel also means new.
Yeah.
The word, the meaning of novel means new, and so these are very precise definitions, and you can see that every word means a lot to the definition of the novel. So look at the third definition, which is on the screen. It reads, a novel is a printed and a bound book, which means it has something to do with the rise of the novel, or the novel form has something to do with the print culture, the production of books. So these are some of the definitions which will help you to understand the complexity surrounding this form that we call the novel.
But when we look at the novel form, we also look at what is the novel in literature. If we look at the novel in literature, you find that it has a very special meaning. Novel also means fresh and new, as Santosh told you, but it also has another meaning. And if you look at your slide, the novel in literature, it refers to an extended fictional prose narrative which is organized around character, plot, certain themes or ideas. So one of the most important features of the novel form is the idea of characters in a plot which tell us about some theme or idea. It is quite long. It has a plot which is unfolded by the actions, speech, and thoughts of the characters. So you can see that the novel in literature is around a story which has characters on one side and a story which has events on the other side. So it is a mix between characters and events that allows you to have a long extended piece of prose writing. As we go forward, we can ask ourselves the question where the novel comes from. And in fact, we see that if you look at your screen,
as you see on your screen,
the novel is...
although the English word novel, I mean, you are very familiar with this, but it has many points of origin. It's a form which grew up in Europe at different points of time. And in Italy, for example, you call a novel novella, and in French it is called novelette, and in Spanish it's called novella, and in Gujarati, for example, we call it novel katha. So novel as a form has different points of origin, and novel, when we are talking about the English novel, we should keep in mind that it's a novel, it's a form which grew in Europe at different points of time, and
it also came to India.
Yeah.
However, if you look at your slide, the term for novel in most European languages except English is roman. And this has been derived from the medieval term romance. Santosh, what are you talking about romance? Is it like Jab We Met or Dil To Pagal Hai?
No, when we are talking about romance in the context of the novel form, I mean, it has a special connotation, it has a special meaning. So, romance, usually we associate it with medieval romances that grew up particularly in medieval England and in medieval Europe. And these romances, like, I mean, usually they are traced back. I mean, the origin of the romance is traced back to, for example, Boccaccio's Decameron. Yeah. And in England, for example, it starts with Malory's Morte d'Arthur. So these are romances which grew up in England.
If you look at your slide, you'll see the definition of a romance. It's a literary genre of high culture, that is, of the upper classes. Romance or chivalric romance is a style of heroic prose and verse narrative that was popular in the aristocratic circles of high medieval and early modern Europe. That is, romances were written approximately in the 13th and 14th centuries. They were fantastic stories. That means they were not real. And they told stories about the supernatural and grand and great heroes who had superhuman ability, who often went on a quest or a journey in search of something or the other.
Or fought with a monster or a giant.
Yes, indeed. And what did they do? If romances told fairy stories and stories of history, but by the 17th century they were completely out of fashion and a new style of writing came into being. So, Santosh, can you tell us a little about this new kind of writing?
Yeah.
But before that, perhaps you could tell us about classical romances?
Usually, literary historians working on this literary form called novel usually trace it back to medieval romance, but some of them trace it back to almost the classical times. For example, some have traced the origin of the novel back to the classical romances of, for example, Ethiopoeica and Heliodorus, and Daphne and Chole by Longus, and the Golden Ass by Apuleius. And but all
All,
these contain some basic elements of novel as we understand them today.
yes.
So the origin of novel usually it's traced back to the romances, either the medieval romances or the classical romances.
Now, if we look at the differences between novels and romances, we have to notice that there are some really important shifts which happen in the novel form. The romances were quite different from the novel form, just as a love story can be quite different from an action movie. So, if you look at your slide, you will see two quotations which can tell you about the difference between the romance and the novel. Santosh, can you read out the characteristics of the romance?
This is actually a quotation which we have taken from Congreve's Incognita.
Yeah.
Congreve, we know him as a dramatist, but actually he is the one who has written the first novel. He has in fact called this his Incognita a novel. So in that book, he writes, romances are composed of the constant loves and invincible courage of heroes and heroines, kings and queens, mortals of the first rank. I mean, that's how he defines the romance. And he defines the novel away from the romance. And he says a novel is, he says novels are of a familiar nature. They come near us and represent to us intrigues in practice. They delight us with accidents and odd events, but not such as are wholly unusual. Romances give more wonder, novels more delight. So you look at these definitions which Congreve gives of the romance and the novel. And this is happening in the beginning of the 18th century. So the novel form was in fact defining itself from a form which was earlier. I mean, usually one traces the origin of the novel to the romances, but this is where the novel actually
breaks away from the romance. If you look at the next slide, you can clearly make out the difference between the romance and the novel. The romance has elaborate diction, distant settings in the past, fantastic happenings.
Yeah, and whereas the novel is usually set in the present or recent past, more spontaneous, written in plain prose, and it's about practical and plausible situations. This is how the novel is usually defined away from the romance.
Now we come now to a new form, and this is a form that takes its place between the romance and the novel. So there was not a sudden jump from the romance to the novel, but instead between the romance and the novel there was another form, and that form is called prose narratives. So what are these prose narratives and when were they written?
Yeah. Particularly literary historians who want to be more precise, they usually trace the origin of the novel to prose narratives and not the romances, because the romances were mostly were written both in verse and in
In
prose.
prose.
Whereas historians who want to be more precise and who want to see novel as a prose, as a form written in prose, they trace the origin of the novel to prose narratives.
And the first prose narrative in English was Malory's Morte d'Arthur, 1485. This started the tradition of telling stories in prose. And in fact, we can say these early experiments led to the beginnings of the prose narrative. Now let's go on to the definitions of a prose narrative. And if you want to define a prose narrative, you first need to look at what prose is. So, Santosh, what is prose? Please
Prose-
look at your slide. What is prose?
Prose can be defined as straightforward discourse or the ordinary form of written or spoken language. And this often makes prose easier to understand. So prose is something that is easier to understand because it is usually the spoken form of the uses the spoken form of the language.
Yes. Something which is ordinary, not extraordinary like poetry. Now, the next question to be asked is, what is narrative? And if we look at the screen, a very simple answer, and that
Narrative
is
can be described as a narrated account, something that is narrated, and something that